Buenas tardes, bienvenidos y bienvenidas. Hoy contamos con la presencia de Clarice desde Brasil, afortunadamente nos visita y creemos muy pertinente esta conferencia. Tuvimos oportunidad de conocerla por aquellas regiones y que nos comentara un poco de su investigación, y consideramos que en las aspiraciones que también tiene la maestría está esta posibilidad de abrirnos a otras concepciones, a otras latitudes y otras formas de ver, de hacer investigación y de ver lo que dicen esas investigaciones en otras regiones. Entonces, muy bienvenida, Clarice, estaremos muy atentos. Antes de presentarte, bueno, ya de una vez te presento mejor. Clarice Saadi es investigadora y activista social enfocada en la opinión pública, el discurso institucional y el análisis de políticas de género. Es directora y cofundadora de Matria, una iniciativa brasileña dedicada a defender los derechos de las mujeres y la transparencia de los datos en la elaboración de políticas. Es experta en la realización de investigaciones nacionales y en la impartición de conferencias públicas. Además, lideró el diseño y la ejecución de la primera encuesta de opinión representativa a nivel nacional en Brasil sobre políticas de autoidentificación de género en 2024. De esto produjo informes públicos analizando datos no verificados de organizaciones no gubernamentales utilizados en discursos nacionales e internacionales. También ha impartido informativos y conferencias a instituciones legales, periodistas y organizaciones de la sociedad civil. Ha desarrollado materiales educativos y mediáticos para mejorar la transparencia y la discusión de políticas basadas en evidencias. Es jefa adjunta del programa de financiamiento audiovisual ANCINE, que es la Agencia Nacional de Cine de Brasil. Le damos la más cordial bienvenida. Y bueno, con la conferencia de la doctora abrimos una serie de conferencias que dan lugar al Seminario de Estudios de Opinión de la doctora Patricia Andrade del CID. Para inaugurar, me gustaría que recibamos unas palabras del coordinador, Rubén Flores González.
Bueno, muchas gracias doctora Alejandra, gracias Clarice, gracias personas por asistir, gracias al personal, a los estudiantes del Centro de Estudios de Opinión. Considero muy relevante el inicio de este seminario y el que ya hemos formalizado ante la universidad y ante Educación Continua, este conjunto de pláticas que ahora llamamos Seminario de Opinión Pública Patricia Andrade del CID. Previamente hemos estado teniendo charlas de manera un poco informal, más o menos espaciadas, pero ahora gracias al esfuerzo de la doctora Alejandra hemos conseguido formalizar, ¿no?, este conjunto de actividades de formación continua. Bueno, claro que también, bueno, muchas personas, ¿no? pero digo, en la medida en que se han ido sumando personas al centro, en la labor académica se ha facilitado, ¿no?, la formalización de espacios. En la mañana nos preguntaban en una reunión que tuvimos con Alma, con Paco, que por qué el nombre de Patricia Andrade para el seminario, y no era la primera vez que nos preguntan. Yo pienso que bueno, la doctora Patti, para quienes la conocimos, fue una mujer que tuvo una actividad académica intensa, que se realizó como académica, y que si bien no tuvo un premio Nobel, no sé, supongo que es lo que a lo mejor a veces se exige, ¿no? Pues hizo lo que tenía que hacer. O sea, y creo que eso es muy importante para las personas hoy en día, dedicarse a su labor, hacerla con gusto y conseguir los logros que uno pueda tener desarrollando al máximo sus capacidades. Y creo que eso fue lo que hizo Patricia, y entre otras cosas pues fue nuestra fundadora, y pues ojalá sigamos manteniendo este seminario. Les agradezco mucho y pues Clarice, gracias por venir, adelante.
Okay. Buenas tardes, lo siento porque no hablaré en portugués, voy a hablar en inglés, pero si no comprenden algo, preguntan que podemos hablar en habilidad con el español o yo digo portugués. Okay, so I'm switching to English, but it's also the first time I present this in English. I hope it will all be well, the survey, vocabulary, and everything. Are there many students here who will be in the workshop the rest of the week? You will be? Okay. There will be some things that will be repeated for you in the workshop, but we will have much more time together, so it doesn't matter because we'll go deeper in a lot of things. I'm here, I think, mostly as the director of Matria, Women's Association And it was Matria who commissioned this survey. Gender Self-ID Identification, a national survey of Brazilian voters' opinion on gender self-ID in Brazil. Matria was created in 2023. It's our first public opinion survey. Actually, I couldn't find opinion surveys done by civil association groups in Brazil focused on either women or trans rights. So that's already an innovation. And we partnered with this with IRG Pesquisa, who did the field, the survey, and it was very important for us to have a partner because since we are a women's group who do advocacy, we didn't want our survey to be questioned. We needed someone who is a professional in that field to help us with the wording for the questions so that they could be considered not leading people too much in one direction or the other. They conducted the field work independently. Since they do a 20%, they listened to 20% of the calls after they were done to check if everything went right. So we asked them, and they agreed to write down all the spontaneous answers in those 20% calls. And then we had access to, without the respondents' information, and that was very interesting to us. And we could also speak with the interviewers, and that was also very nice. They decided on a group of women only, since they thought the subject was complicated and people respond better to women. And in training, they said the women were scared because of the subject, that they would be shouted at or treated aggressively. And in the end, none of that happened. And they said that actually people wanted to talk a lot about the topic. They were mostly very interested and wanted to keep talking about their perceptions on all of this. This survey has been presented in December 2024 at the Abrapel's International Seminar, where we won a second place Innovation Prize. It was presented in WAPOR, Latin America, where I met Alejandra and Ruben, and then also at Diálogos Eleitorais with Maria Laura Tajina from Argentina, Urpi Torado de Peru, Luciana Paque from Brazil, all from this sector. So, what was our motivation for this? We noticed that concepts such as gender identity, trans woman, self-identification, and others are still very unfamiliar to most Brazilians. We could see that in our daily dealings. And the aim of the survey was to measure society's understanding of the changes introduced by self-identification policies. I'm going to define what that is in a while. So we wanted to assess acceptance or rejection of replacing sex with gender identity in laws, public policies, institutions, and shared spaces. And that because self-ID policies are already a reality in many countries, including Brazil and Mexico. But while making a search in all the academic databases, we found very little papers on the issue that dealt with surveys. I have found other surveys online, but not treated academically. We only found 4 in the United States and 1 in Taiwan. So ours is the first one in Brazil. So talking about self-identification, this is a concept that was that is really not created but becomes more institutionalized since the Yogyakarta Principles. That is a document that was drafted in 2006 by a group of 29 activists, experts, jurists in the city Yogyakarta in Indonesia. They are not part of Brazilian law or anyone else's law. They have never been adopted by any member state of the UN or nothing like that, but it has become often mentioned as soft law. Most of the countries, when adopting self-ID or other legislation that has to do with trans rights, they mention the Ugarten principles. And so they have been driving legal changes that end up overriding international agreements that have been signed by countries, like the CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of all Forms of Discrimination Against Women. That is a treaty, an international treaty signed by both Brazil and Mexico, and that is based on sex. Okay, so gender identity there is defined as internal experiences, sensations, ways of dressing, speaking, or mannerisms that may or may not correspond to the sex assigned at birth. And there are 29 principles, so I'm just mentioning a few things. But they call for legal recognition of gender identity based on self-declaration only. What that means is no need for surgeries, no need for hormones or show psychiatric evaluation or present a legal case to get that change in your documents, to change name and change the sex marker. They call for a person to be able to choose the prison establishment they want to go to according to gender identity, the inclusion of gender identity in school curriculum to be taught, and easily accessible hormones and surgeries. And then 10 years later, 2017, there are more principles created, so it's the Ugarten principles plus 10. And now it differentiates gender ID from gender expression, where previously they were synonyms. So now a person can declare a gender identity that won't match what's their gender expression as perceived by society. And they call once more to be able to change legal sex, gender, or name without any conditions. But they also call to eliminate sex markers altogether in every document, so that wouldn't even be mentioned anymore in birth certificates, in the driver's license, passports, anything like that. In Brazil, a great part of the Ugarten principles in regard to self-ID were institutionalized and became part of our legal system through a decision. ADI is an action of direct unconstitutionality. So it was challenged, saying that it was unconstitutional for Brazil to ask people to do body changes or anything else to change their documents. And so our Supreme Court decided that yes, people can change first name and sex without the need of anything, surgeries, hormones, judicial authorization, or psych evaluation. This is very easy today in Brazil. A person just goes to the notary to do that, and the change goes back to birth certificate and everything, all the other documents from there on. But the thing is, sex, gender identity, and sexual orientations are different things that have been lately sometimes conflicted. But here we're using an anthropologist called Grossi, Medium Grossi, that defines sex as biological, male or female. Gender is a polysemic word that has many meanings depending on the theory and who's using it. So for feminist theory from the 60s and 70s, it's a set of roles, of stereotypes built on the distinction of sexes to create meaning and hierarchy. So there are two sexes, and it's the imposition of gender roles that will create a hierarchy that oppresses women. But for queer theory, gender is a choice of performance that can be dissociated from sex. So your gender might not have anything to do with your sex. It doesn't consider it something that is built upon sex anymore, with feminist theory. And sometimes It's used nowadays as a synonym for sex or for gender identity, which can be confusing. Gender identity, as we saw, is an internal sense of oneself. It's personal and subjective experience. And sexual orientation is the direction of a person's desire, which is analytically independent from all the others. So I already mentioned the CEOA, and that Yogarta principles replace sex with gender identity in all contexts. And this is a rupture with the CEOA that treats gender as socially constructed roles and behavior. And this was signed by 189 countries, and only 6 didn't sign, including the United States. So, Article 1 defines very clearly that the term discrimination against women shall mean any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex. So here they're treating sex, and on Article 5, they say that states parties shall take all appropriate measures to modify social and cultural patterns of constructs of men and women. They want to eliminate prejudices that are based on stereotyped roles, so gender. What is our justification still on that part for this survey and for our interest as a women's group in the issue? Is that once adopted by a country, self-ID will change the entire legal system. A lot of other things have to change to accommodate this new idea. So there are laws regulating legal sex change. Usually, soon there are removal of age restrictions, removal of sex markers and documents. You have to have new anti-discrimination laws targeting specifically self-declared prejudice against self-declared identity. Still with the impacts, because of men's strength, height, speed, skeletal and muscular mass that on average are significantly greater than women's, there has been historically use of male physical force to impose superiority and coerce women. And on the 20th century, when women were being more incorporated into public life, there was also the creation of spaces exclusive for women to protect them from violence. And so both laws and social norms supported the separation by sex of, for example, bathrooms, prisons, shelters, locker rooms, hospital wings, breastfeeding spaces, and sports. Here just a more specific example, that starting in the 1980s, the feminist movements started creating exclusive shelters for women who were victims of violence to keep them safe from aggressors. And slowly by slowly, this became state policy in many countries. And self-identification impacts the organization of those spaces, allowing people of the male sex to gain, based on self-ID, access to those spaces. In Brazil, what's called Casa da Mulher Brasileira, which is the shelters from the government, provides care and shelter services to male who self-identify as women. In Spain too, and there's record of at least 6 people from the male sex that change sex registration and try to gain access to the same centers where their victims are located. There are, in most countries, also prizes, scholarships, quotas, and benefits that were created for women to mitigate inequalities between the sexes. And with self-ID, those two can get affected because now they are open to people who self-declare a gender identity as a woman. In Brazil, for example, this is something I have been talking to Ruben, because apparently here it's different. Mexico has solved that issue, but in Brazil, campaign resources and electoral quotas created to increase women's presence in politics are now shared with male persons, and Brazil is the country that most elects trans-identified people, trans women. In the last election, it was for the legislature in Brazil, but there were 30 candidates elected in the female force. Official data is also impacted because when public records no longer picture male and female sexes but self-ID, you can have a blackout of some data, especially concerning women. Data that is important to build public policy. And the UK government commissioned an independent review by Dr. Alice Sullivan, and she analyzed 800 administrative databases, surveys, academic research, and well, she saw that only 16% of the country's statistics were using the term sex. She advised the government that sex and gender identity must be collected separately because otherwise this impacts public policy for women. And she showed how there was already impact on data from health, crime, education, and more. For example, in Scotland, men's sexual crimes, if they self-declared as women, were being reported as crimes done by women, and it was very contradictory because in their law, there can only be rape if there's penetration, if there's penis, and then you started having a number of women committing rape. Impact on freedom of expression and association because women don't have anymore some spaces, intimate spaces like breastfeeding support groups, dating apps for lesbian women that are for the female sex only. And language is also affected. Not only because of the change of words, but in Brazil, for example, what is called transphobia, although it's not defined, is a criminal offense. And so even stating a person's sex might be considered a crime. You never know, depending on if the person decides to prosecute, and that affects people's possibility of expressing concerns. So in Brazil, we have women that are currently suffering criminal prosecution for pointing out the presence of, she called it a man, in a woman's bathroom, or questioning the use of women's quota and things like that. And the laws that already exist, and that all mention the term sex, no one really knows how to interpret them anymore, because there are laws for maternity leave, early retirement, they're all based on sex differences, and same with the separated spaces as we thought. And now the interpretation of this is always being challenged. And cultural notions such as privacy for the separate spaces, they are intertwined with biology because they are based on facts for women like menstruation, breastfeeding, female anatomy, and the differences between the sexes. So even though they might be cultural notions, the complete dissociation of them from biology has created some conflicts in society. And what we see is a tension between individual and community, because sex is based on a common and shared knowledge of observable reality, and gender identity is based on subjectivity. So there has been a lot of tension arising in society because of that, and the main cost of erasing sex and of everything we've seen is borne by women and girls. So now we're getting to the research. You probably know of that way better than me, the methodology part, but I'm going to tell it to you. The population was of Brazilian voters, meaning over 16 years old. A sample of 1,100 voters stratified by sex, age, education, socioeconomic level, and region. The method was telephone interviews. It covered 188 municipalities in all the states of Brazil and the federal district. It was done between September and November 2024. It took a long time because there were elections in October. And so the company that was doing it for us kept asking for more time, because they were also focused on the elections. The confidence level was 95% with a margin of error of 3 percentage points. It was a 3-stage probabilistic selection. First stage, the municipalities were drawn using probability proportional to size. The second stage, census tracts drawn using PPS. And the third stage, respondents were selected by quotas. For us, it was essential that the questionnaires' questions adequately captured it's always important, what is intended to be analyzed. And so given the unprecedented nature of this research and the fact that it's a subject that is quite new, relatively new to society, we thought a lot about the construction of this questionnaire with the help of IRG Pesquisa to get the correct answers for the interviews. I don't mean correct in what they say, but that they understand what they're being asked and they are able to respond. So the first question for us was if the Brazilian population was familiar with the terms that we wanted to research. And what we did was use Google Trends to ask, and we entered a few search terms, and we saw that the one that is lower and then goes up is what is a trans woman. The second one, the red one, is trans person, and up there also going up is trans woman. But when we compare that to the word that is more used in Brazil, that is historically used in Brazil, travesti, is the one that is way, way higher, the mustard yellow one. And we see that actually transgender, gender identity, and trans woman are really, really low. People are not searching it that much, but you see in 2024, trans woman starts going a bit up. So we were worried about how to formulate the questions about trans women to ensure that everyone was understanding and talking about the same thing. We were worried that asking about trans women, people would not all understand the same thing, since clearly from the searches there was some doubt, or it's not even that much, let's say, search for it. And since we are a women's group and we were mostly interested in what people thought about trans women and women's spaces or how it impacts women, it was all focused on that, on trans women, not trans men. So what we decided to do is have one open-ended question. From what you have heard, what is a trans woman? And all the others were closed-ended questions. For example, should a male person who self-identifies as a woman have the right to compete in female sports category? So in all the other questions, we described what a trans woman is. A male person who self-identifies as a woman, to make sure that everyone knew what we were talking about. And the other existing surveys that I mentioned, the 4 American ones on this side, they don't use ever trans woman. They say transgender people, transgender athletes, transgender rights, gender neutral bathrooms. So maybe they avoid that issue, but also they assume that respondents understand those terms. They simply ask it. On the other hand, the Taiwan survey defines terms at the beginning. So they define trans woman as someone who's male at birth identifies or lives as a woman, no surgery. That's what they said. Trans man, female at birth, identify, live as man, no surgery. And transsexual woman, a male at birth, post-surgery. So this survey innovates by testing the population's comprehension with the open-ended question. So part one, we start with the open question. There was no consensus at all. There was very low consistency in how people understood or explained trans women. From 1,100 interviews, there were 220 different unique responses provided. 30.6% were unique. The top 20 answers represented just 54.5% of the responses. And the conclusion was that 62% of Brazilians do not know that a trans woman is a male person who self-identifies as a woman. And here we join them in categories, the responses, and to see the diversity in them. The first part is what we consider those who understood, who knows what a trans woman is. Because they answer things like a man who identifies, feels, wants to be, tries to be a woman. 25% of the answers. There they're talking about self-ID. The second line mentions modifying a body. Then there's a man who acts, dresses, or behaves like a woman. A man who became a woman, who does not accept himself, feels uncomfortable. That ended up being 38% of our respondents. Then there was quite a big share, 12%, who thinks that a trans woman is a woman. So a woman who identifies as a man, so actually a trans man. There's confusion there. All the answers are, there's answers, a woman who is a lesbian, bisexual or heterosexual, I don't even know. Dresses or behaves like a man, does not accept herself. Here, it feels like answers that don't really know that a trans woman has to necessarily be a male person to start with, because the answer was a person who identifies, feels, wants to be of the other sex, behaves like the other sex, modifies the body, all of that again. There were answers focused on sexuality, so a homosexual or bisexual man. Some answers about intersex condition, others, and 18% said I don't know or did not answer. So there were a lot of different elements referenced around this idea of trans woman and self-identification, because identification, feelings, inner essence, desire, clothing, behavior, body modification, sexuality or sexual practices, intersex condition, and circular definition. A trans person is someone who identifies as trans, which is not much of an explanation. This definitely has an impact on public debate, because the media, the government, public policies, everything is getting done talking to the Brazilian population about trans women, as if everyone is understanding what's going on. And we figured out that, well, most people are not. And there's a high probability that when the debate is going on and people even give their opinions or something like, should a trans woman share a female space, they are answering maybe thinking that it's a female who presents masculine, or we don't really know what's going on, so we have to be careful there. Oh, I don't know, it's really good. Institutions. So now let's see the close-ended questions. Because of how self-ID works, that it's something purely illocutionary, which is an act of saying that transforms reality. Just like when a priest says, you are now married, and that changes reality, self-ID is an illocutionary act. And that's it. It's the only definition. You say you are of the other sex or non-binary, and then you are, you become that. So it doesn't allow for any conditions, since countries have been adopting that from Yogyakarta principles. And because of that, we decided that our proxy for acceptance of gender self-identifications would be only the percentage of those who fully agreed on Likert scales. Because those who partially agreed, that meant they had a condition to agree. And there are no possible conditions when you're talking about self-ID. Self-ID is self-ID. Either you accept that or you don't. And because we had access to the people's comments, we did realize that even those who strongly agreed, so the ones that we counted as agreeing with self-identification policies, they still voiced conditions. They still believe that medical procedures are necessary. We'll see that. So, first question, should male people who self-ID as women also have the right to use female bathrooms? When we join the completely disagree, partially disagree, and partially agree, we get 81.4% of the Brazilian voters who don't agree, because only 18.6% said that they completely agreed that male people who self-ID as women have the right to use female bathrooms. And here we have some of the comments. I only chose comments that will show those who partially agreed or agreed, still mentioning conditions. So if the bathroom is partitioned, yes, but I think the right thing would be to have separate bathrooms. If the person already changed their body, then yes, but if not, I think it's complicated. I partly agree, but it would be good to have separate bathrooms for trans people so problems are avoided. I agree, so here it's a totally agree, but with rules to ensure that women feel safe too. I partly agree, but I think it depends on the place. In school, for example, it could cause confusion. Here, should male people who self-ID as women have the right to share a prison cell with women in female prisons? Again, almost the same number, 81%, do not completely agree. So 81% of Brazilian voters don't agree with that policy. That I don't know how it is in Mexico, but in many countries, it's a fact. In Brazil, in theory, trans women can ask to go to female prison and be in separate cells, but we know from being in contact with women who work in those places that often prisons don't have enough space and everyone ends up sharing, so that's why the question. Spontaneous comments. If the person had gender reassignment surgery, yes. Otherwise not, for still having the male order. Yes, as long as they have transitioned and have medical and legal support, there's no problem. I agree, but I think it has to be evaluated case by case, ensuring everyone's safe. Yes, if the person has gone through the process, I see no problem. I think it has to be evaluated because you can't put everyone together without thinking of women's safety. This can be dangerous. Yes, if they have already changed their body, or I don't know, maybe that's the same one as up there. So again, yes, but with conditions. So not exactly self-ID. Should male people who self-ID as women have the right to compete in female sports category? 78.5% do not completely agree. So it's a bit higher number, and it's interesting because since I've been studying all that for a long time, I know that every country has a different issue that really makes everyone tick. And in the United States, for example, is the sports that get the population really going and rejecting self-ID. In Brazil, it's more about than, for example, sports. Some comments. I agree, but I think there should be medical monitoring to ensure the competition is fair. I partly agree. I think the person should be respected, but the physical issue needs to be considered. I agree, but only if the person undergoes hormonal treatment and has an adaptation plan. I partly agree, but there should be specific rules for these cases to ensure equity. And here was a very important question for us. Are women who feel uncomfortable sharing spaces such as bathrooms, changing rooms, hospital wards, or prisons with male people who self-ID as women bigoted? Because in the public debate that we get that a lot, and there are even women being criminalized for stating that they are uncomfortable with this. But 75.3% of people said that no, they did not completely agree with that statement. I partly agree because it's a matter of safety, but I don't think women feel uncomfortable or prejudiced. I agree, but everyone's safety must also be analyzed before making any change. I partly agree, but it is necessary to ensure the situation is well analyzed, not to generate discomfort or risk for anyone. Now for social benefits. Maternity leave. There is precedent in Brazil of trans women being granted maternity leave. It can be 4 months if you're in the private sector, it's the minimum. Some companies will give more. And 6 months in the public sector. And because trans women can also feature as mother in the birth certificate, they have, justice system has allowed some trans women to also have 4 months or 6 months alongside their partner who is the biological mother of the children. And we'll see that more than half of Brazilians completely oppose granting that maternity leave. But those who agreed mainly supported maternity leave or children leave, I don't know what the name would be, for anyone adopting a child, anyone having a child, not something specific for trans women. So here we have, here it didn't make sense for us anymore to join the categories as we did, because previously we were talking about, do you accept or not a person who self-ID in a space? And because you cannot put a condition on self-ID, I accept if there has been a surgery, we chose to join the 3 categories that didn't completely agree. But here it doesn't make that sense anymore, because people can have all be anywhere in the scale. So 52.6% completely disagree with the maternity leave, 26.8% completely agree with that right for someone who self-IDs as a woman who has a child. Oh, I didn't put quotes, I thought I had. University quotas. I don't know if you have that here, but in Brazil, no? Okay. In Brazil we have university quotas. We have a law for university quotas for Black people, but it has to do also with, economic income. Economic income regardless of color, race, people with disabilities, and indigenous people. Those exist by law. But over 30 public universities have now adopted entry quotas for trans people, even without there being a law. So they were not publicly debated or sanctioned by the state like the other ones. And they are the only quota that doesn't need any proof, because it's self-ID only. Because being a trans person is self-declared. Black people have to go before a panel that will judge if they are Black, which means a lot of confusion, because in Brazil we're a very mixed population, and I think it's very hard to say if someone is or isn't sufficiently Black, so there are always problems with that, but it exists. Indigenous people have to be validated by their community, that they have to be from a territory, and people from there have to say that they are part of this. People with disabilities have to have a medical record of disability, and you also have to prove public income. It's usually also associated with if the person asking for the quota went to public school and not private school. You cannot have gone to private school to go to access the quota. So we'll see the results, but a lot of the people who fully agree also had a but it should be evaluated more carefully, weighing the feasibility and compatibility of those quotas with the rights of other groups. And again, it was half the population completely disagreed with those quotas. Oh, there are initiatives for quotas for trans people and travestis in universities and public service entry exams. Do you completely agree, partially disagree, or completely disagree with that? It's starting in the public service because to work for the government in Brazil, you have to take exams. And some government bodies are starting to also have transgender quotas, even though we don't know, like officially, what is how many transgender people there are in Brazil. There are only estimates that 1 or 2%. Quotas have been around 2 or 5% of the spots. So perceptions about language. With self-ID, there has been language changes. A lot of people are advocating for terminology changes. Either new pronouns in Portuguese, a person who self-IDs as non-binary will ask to be called, for example, Elu, instead of ele for a man, ela for a woman, Elu for non-binary, and Delu. Also, there are new terms being created, either calling women cisgender women, which is something recent, or menstruating, and neutralizing markedly female terms such as mother by becoming birthing person, lactating person. In Brazil, there was an interesting case last year where the Supreme Court was about to rule that in the declaration of babies born alive, which is the first document that any hospital has to give a newborn, that mother be replaced by birthing person. And it was actually my organization, Matria, submitted an advocacy brief arguing against that. In the end, it stayed, there are the options, mother/birthing person. So if it's a female who does not identify as a woman, there's a choice of birthing person. But very strangely, the other option is father/legal guardian, which makes me think, is the one who birthed not a legal guardian? I don't know. It was a very unsatisfying decision, even if mother was not completely erased. So apart from that, we have many government campaigns that now avoid completely using the words girls or women. They use people who menstruate here to announce free sanitary pads. And there's an example of referring to mother as birthing person. Where is it? A pessoa que gesta, he was the person who gestated. This was the highest disapproval we had. The questions, there were 2 questions and we got the exact same numbers. Do you approve or disapprove substituting the word mother for birthing person? Do you approve or disapprove substituting the word woman for person who menstruates? And 89.8% disapprove, almost 90%. The socio-demographic variables. So we had data on sex, sexual orientation, trans identity, age, race, color, education, region, monthly family income, occupation, political orientation, religion, if the person had or didn't have children, most frequent channel of information, political specter, and voting behavior at the last presidential election. And the key factors that influenced their responses to self-ID policies were in this order, both at the last election that was very polarized between Lula and Bolsonaro, sex and parental status. And So voting for President Lula in 2022, so identifying more to the left, being female and not having children is associated with a more favorable position regarding policies based on self-ID. But even so, here analysis by voting pattern to the bathroom question. If male people with self-IDs, women should use female bathrooms. So it's very impressive. Bolsonaro voters rejected it, did not completely agree. 95.6% of them. But even Lula's voters, the majority of them, 67.8%, also do not completely agree. And this is very important because we have an upcoming election next year. And I'm pretty sure this issue will be a major issue, just like it has been in the States, in the Trump election. And the left in Brazil is completely embracing all of the agenda without any nuance, without allowing for any questioning, criminalizing women who try to raise any questions. And even Lula's voters are not convinced in their majorities. Analysis by sex. So women are more likely to be favorable because less women, 77.4%, disagree with male people in female bathrooms, but it's still a high number. And men disagree in 85.5% of cases. And I think predictably, people who have children do not completely agree in higher numbers. 83.9% of them do not agree with male people self-IDing into female bathrooms. But non-parents also rejected it by 74.8%. Asians and implications. We wanted to research the Brazilians' opinion on policies based on gender self-ID with the care that I told you to use clear and simple language, and also showing people the direct implications from the policies. So asking about real situations that are happening in Brazil as a consequence of self-ID. And the results, we think, were interpreted from the point of view of what the concept of gender self-ID proposes. A substitution of the sex marker by the verbal declaration of the other sex, excluding any other requirements, which was joining all the categories that did not completely agree. So as we saw, I don't know, it's repeated, there are some strange things. As we saw, 61% of the population doesn't know what a trans woman means, even though that term is now more frequently used by everyone, by the media and public policies than travesti, who is less used, but is very clear for everyone on the meaning, and what is the sex of the person who identifies as travesti. And this is an alert for researchers who wish to capture the opinion of people around the subject, to not assume that people being researched understand what they're being asked. So just here again, together, most of the population opposes policies based on self-ID, especially those with direct impact for women. Those were the most rejected. The opposition around 80 for the spaces in sports and 89.3% for language changes. Again, as we've seen, of those who completely agreed, many assume this required surgeries, hormones, or legal steps. So this means there's also no understanding of what gender self-ID means, and that the current Brazilian policies are of this nature. It was very clear that people weren't really aware that no other steps were needed. So we face a serious disconnection between laws and policies around self-ID that are bringing profound changes and public understanding and support, because there are a lot of changes happening and people are not understanding or supporting them. And as I said, the topic is shaping up to be a main dispute in next year's presidential election. Unfortunately, Brazil, very much like the United States, is very polarized right now, and this is an issue who is being very appropriated by the far right for its own reasons. Very different, for example, for those who will read the workshop, I will talk extensively about the United Kingdom, where things are very different, and this issue is not polarized around oh, you're far right, or so. And we think that the survey's findings are crucial to public and legislative debate, as well as for policymakers. That was our aim as an advocacy group, to also be able to share those results. And we hope we can open a productive debate, because the state has been implementing self-ID policies without it. And despite the lack of knowledge or understanding from the population, Brazilian women are being very violently silenced and persecuted for talking about all this. And yeah, that's it. I don't even know how much I went too fast. That's it.